All right, we are live. I'm going to give it a couple of seconds for people to join in. Okay, I see we have 34 viewers and counting. So, hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar by English for IT on cultural sensitivity and cross-cultural communication, right? And the whole point of this webinar is to really get you at ease with working and communicating with multicultural teams and international clients. If it's your first time joining an English for IT webinar, English for IT is a language and soft skills education company with a focus on providing courses and content for tech professionals worldwide, right? So we've got a presence in many different countries. We have students from all around the globe, and we've been in the business for well over a decade now. And it's really a pleasure to have you all on this webinar today. And personally, I'm really happy to see people chiming in the chat. We have Cesar there saying hello. Well, hello. And it's really great knowing that people have taken time out of their day to be with us today. So just a few ground rules before we get started. Well, ground rules and recommendations, I'd say. Number one, feel free to be active in the chat and contribute to the discussion. I can see what you're writing in my little chat window over here. So if you have any questions, any comments, or if you'd just like to chime in, please feel free. I only ask that you don't spam the chat, and try not to be nasty in the chat, right? Just treat it like you would any other conversation with a friend, and we'll be fine. In the chat and on some of the slides, you'll see a link to a form to complete. And once you do that, you will get a really nice, shiny English for IT certificate, right? Showing that you've attended this webinar and, that you're now kind of an expert at cross-cultural communication, right? Or at least that's the hope with this webinar. And we have that link to the form in the chat right now, so feel free to go there. All right, and to get us all warmed up, since we have a couple of people in the chat, I've got a couple of questions for you. Why don't you let me know in the chat what your role is and what cultures you and your team work with. So feel free to post in the chat. I'll see it, and it just gives me an idea of what sort of audience I'm working with today. By the way, my name is Karuna Krishnasamy. You can see a picture of me up there in the top right-hand corner of the slides. And I am an English and soft skills coach at English for IT. And I've also been working in the tech industry for well over a decade. And I manage teams based outside the US. So I'm quite familiar with working with people from all around the globe. I see we have Allison here, head of HR in a global organization spanning the US, Canada, Ukraine, and Poland. Cool. Got some project managers. Daria, hello. Leticia, HRBP in Brazil. Cool. All right. Excellent. So, and Julia, of course, CEO, QA engineer, working in Ukraine, communicating with American and German teams, assistant to the city mayor. All right, cool. All right, so it's good to see that there's a lot of people from all around the world, and you guys definitely do work with a variety of different cultures. So it's going to be a good webinar for you guys. What we're going to cover. We're going to cover what cultural sensitivity means in the modern workplace, what that entails. We will discuss key cultural differences that are good to keep in mind when you're dealing with your colleagues and clients. And we'll also cover some strategies to help you improve your cross-cultural communication, right? And a lot of these strategies may seem simple and straightforward, but trust me, when you actively implement them, when you actively think about implementing some of these strategies that we'll cover, it'll make sense, and it will make your conversations with different teammates go a lot smoother, right? Trust me on that. And there'll also be time at the end for a bit of a Q&A, right? If you'd like to ask me questions, feel free at the end. And of course, as with every webinar, it wouldn't be a webinar if we didn't give you some goodies. So we have a promotion on the Power Skills for Work course, very good course by English for IT. Since you guys have joined the webinar here today and you're spending time with me, we are offering the Power Skills for Work course at 35% off if you use the code POWER, right? So it's a gift from us at English for IT to you for joining the webinar today, right? That's POWER, and you get 35% off. And we have a link in the chat just to make it easier for you. So starting us off, well, what exactly is cultural sensitivity, right? You've all gotten up and joined this webinar today, so you likely have some idea of what it is, but it's always good to sort of formalize that thought around what exactly is cultural sensitivity. Well, it's essentially having awareness and respect for differences between cultures, right? And that's especially important if you work in a company that is very geographically distributed, right? And I see that a lot of you do work for such companies, right? So I see a product manager working with teams in Canada, LATAM, Eastern Europe, business development manager with clients from the US, EU, UAE, people from Argentina. So you guys do work in roles and in companies that involve cross-cultural communication, and cultural sensitivity is just building the awareness and recognition that people from different places, from different cultures, think and speak and may act differently from what you're used to, from what your cultural lens is, right? And we all have our own cultural lenses, right? We all are very influenced from where we grew up, from where we spent a lot of our time in our formative years, right? So we all have a cultural lens, and this lens is different depending on where you grew up. And if you work in a company or in a role that involves dealing with many different people, then you have to be aware that people are different. And cultural sensitivity is just building that awareness, right? So that you can be more respectful in your communications and therefore more effective. And there's a very good book called The Culture Map, which I highly recommend that you guys check out, maybe have a read, get the Cliff Notes. And a quote from this book by Erin Mayer is, if you go into every interaction assuming that culture doesn't matter, your default mechanism will be to view others through your own cultural lens and to misjudge them accordingly, right? And that goes back to what I was saying about all of us having our own cultural background and cultural lens based on where we grew up. But if we view other people through that same lens, we may misjudge them because we don't understand why they're not fitting a pattern of behavior that is familiar to us, right? And that leads to misunderstandings, that leads to you being judgmental or feeling judged, right? And in a work environment, you don't really want that, right? Work should be fun. Or at the very least, work should not be very confrontational. And how does this help, right? How does learning other cultures help you? Well, like I said, it makes work more fun. It makes work less confrontational because you're you're avoiding misunderstanding, you're kind of sidestepping conflict. In a way, it will help you understand your own culture better, right? I have a funny story about this. So I spent many years in Ukraine, right? I lived in Ukraine for 6.5 years, and one thing that I always noticed, and I'm going to post this in the chat, is that people wrote smiley faces with just an open bracket, right? So hi with just a couple of brackets, and this is very unique to that part of the world, right? And the first time, one of my Ukrainian friends sent a smiley, without the eyes, right, without the semicolon eyes, I had no idea what they were trying to say, right? Um, and being living in Ukraine, having that experience really helped me understand, that small aspect of the culture, right? That the smileys are different, right? And it really helps you get to know someone a bit better, right? And that's a very, very small example, but there are others that sort of build on that and show you how your culture may be different, helps you understand your own culture better, and it makes you a more empathetic individual, right? Um, you will stop attributing communication issues to the person, right? You won't think, oh, this person is, he's just not communicative at all. You'll have a better understanding of why it is they're acting in a certain way, right? Because a lot of it can be cultural and not necessarily down to the individual, right? So, what are some cultural differences or concepts that you can look out for when examining how a culture communicates? And the first thing I want to talk about is high context versus low context cultures. And this idea comes from the Culture Map, the book I was talking about. And it essentially categorizes cultures uh, into two communication types, right? Cultures that use high context communication and cultures that use low context communication, right? And these are generalizations, but they are generalizations that are based in a little bit of reality, right? High context cultures tend to be ones where relationships are very important, right? And they tend to be more hierarchical, right? There is a hierarchy involved with communication. Communication can be very indirect and implicit, right? Where you don't really say what you mean explicitly, you sort of dance around the problem, right? Or you discuss the issue in very indirect ways because being direct could be seen as rude, right? Or breaking the hierarchy. People sort of read the air, they read the room, they pick up on facial cues, on body language a lot more, and this sort of high context cultural communication tends to be more prevalent in countries with a long shared history, right? Japan, for example, right, has had a very long shared history where they've been a very monoethnic culture, right? There's really one ethnic group in Japan, and they tend to be very high context communicators. It's a very hierarchical culture, right? Low context cultures, on the other hand, are cultures in which communication is a lot more direct, a lot more explicit. You spell things out, you say what you mean, right? And um, these countries, or these cultures rather, tend to emphasize directness more than maintaining the hierarchy, right? Management styles may be a bit more flat, or a lot more flat in a lot of cases. Feedback can be more direct, right? Communication generally tends to be more factual and delivered without a lot of, I like to call it fluff, right? Without a lot of padding to it. Um, Business culture in the US is low context, right? You uh, being explicit about what you're asking for, about what you're saying is encouraged, right? Um, Companies in the US tend to have a lot more flat management structures versus a lot of companies in Asia where the CEO is, very far removed from frontline workers, right? And keeping this idea of high and low context communication in mind can help you navigate or understand why people are communicating in a certain way versus what you're used to. And I often get asked which style is better, right? Better. And when it comes to communication, it's it's a question of preference, and it's a question of what's effective for that given region, right? And people have different points of view based on where they grew up. And if, for example, you grew up in a culture that uses low context communication, well, high context speakers can be seen as unprofessional or vague, right? Like, oh, why isn't this person getting to the point? Right? Why aren't they saying what they mean? Why are they saying yes they really when it's not necessarily the case, right? High context speakers, on the other hand, may find low context communicators way too direct or even rude. Like, wow, this my manager just asked me such a direct question or gave me such direct feedback that am I in trouble? Am I? Is this a problem? Right? So it isn't a question of whether one style is better. It's a question of how can I adapt and understand the other person, right? And it says there in the slide, the key to effective communication is being aware of this cultural communication style and adapting accordingly, right? And just to recap, low context communication, clarity and candor is valued. You put everything in writing. Well, you put a lot in writing, right? You recap the main points, and the speaker is responsible for conveying the message effectively. In general, right? The speaker is the one that has the burden of making sure that um, content or instructions are delivered clearly. And so if it's not well understood, then it's probably the speaker's fault versus the listener. In high context communication, again, to recap, it's more nuanced, more complex. There's a lot more formality around it. You don't say what you assume people already know, and this can be dangerous, right? Um, because there's this feeling of hierarchy, right? If you say something that you think the boss already knows, that can be seen as you thinking that he doesn't know what he's talking about, or that he or she is not a very good boss, right? So it's dangerous. And effective communication kind of depends on the listener. The listener has to read between the lines, as it were, to understand whether or not what someone is saying, if that corresponds to to what they mean, right? So there's a lot of interpretation involved. So then the question arises, well, how do you work with high context speakers? Well, trust is really important, right? Building trust, right? Trying to build a relationship with someone from a high context culture is really quite key, right? Because if you don't have that trust, if you don't have that relationship, you probably won't be very good at reading between the lines when they say something, or they will say things to please you instead of portraying things as they really are, right? And I'm sure you've all had this experience where you've asked someone, do you think this is possible, or do you think this feature can be done by next week? And they're from a culture where saying no is very difficult, right? So they'll say like, oh yes, we'll try our best, or yes, we can do it, and then it turns out that that wasn't the case, right? Where if you had a stronger relationship, if you observe them a bit more, have that trust, you might get either a more straightforward answer, or you might understand when they're feeling a little bit of discomfort, right? And then you can ask more follow-up questions like, okay, I see that you're a little bit uneasy. What's causing this unease, right? How can we hit this target, right? On the other hand, well, just hit my mic there. On the other hand, working with low context speakers, it's really more about just stating facts and recapping, and is a lot more straightforward, right? You introduce your main point, you tell them what it's about, and then you summarize. A good example in the slides here. Let me give you a quick update on the status of the project. Development is 90% complete. QA team will start testing next Monday, and we expect to deploy by the end of next week. In summary, deployment is almost done. QA begins Monday. Short, sweet, to the point. You don't have to put a lot of padding into it. It'll be appreciated by someone from a low context culture as having all the data needed, and just being very straightforward. Feedback. So feedback is another sort of thorny point when it comes to cross-cultural communication, right? Different cultures give and receive feedback in radically different ways. But first, I want to ask the group here: are you comfortable expressing negative feedback directly? Why don't you let me know in the chat? If so, why? And if not, why not? Right? Just let me know. Also gives me a chance to have some water, you know. Good to have these breaks. Artyom's saying sure. That's good. Anybody else? Are you guys comfortable expressing negative feedback? Not comfortable? Yes, can't fix something if you don't know the problem. That's very true. Nope, prefer to bring positive news. Yeah, so there's a mix. There's a mixture, right? Some people are comfortable expressing negative feedback. Some people not as much. See, we've got Anna here with a very good point. Not comfortable, but also I don't like sugarcoating. True, I'm kind of like that as well, right? I'm not the best at giving negative feedback, but I also don't like when feedback is given to me in a sugar-coated way. So I feel you there. We call it corrective feedback. Okay, that's a good way of putting it. Corrective feedback. Yes, keeping it professional, not personal. Okay. Yeah, so there's a mix, right? Some people are comfortable expressing negative feedback, some people are not. And that's the same when it comes to different cultures, right? Some cultures are very big on very direct feedback, and some cultures not as much, right? And this is a kind of a generalization, right? Of course, this depends on individuals within a certain culture, but in general, cultures that do have more direct negative feedback on the left here, and cultures where negative feedback is very indirect is on the right. Oh, is there something wrong with the mic? Test. How about now? Are you guys good with the mic? Let me switch to another. There's B inside the mic. Now it's good. Okay, I switched to my AirPods. So cool, great. So we fixed that. Nice. All right. So again, as I was saying, this is a generalization, but it's a generalization based on a little bit of fact, right? I grew up in Malaysia, right? And Malaysia's not on this diagram here, but I can tell you from learned experience, Malaysia would be like really far to the right there, right? Feedback is definitely indirect. We really don't like direct feedback at all. Negative feedback, that is, right? And so, how do you give feedback? Well, before we get into that, there are cultures that can be low context and indirect with their feedback. For example, the US can be seen as generally a low context culture where facts and information is delivered in a more direct way, but feedback tends to be more indirect, tends to be a bit more sugarcoating involved, right? Ukraine, on the other hand, high context culture, but direct negative feedback is more common, right? I see. Uh, are you guys still having problems with the audio? Let me just double check the audio here with my team. Okay, audio's good. All right. So let me know in the chat if the audio freaks out a bit. Okay. Um, so how how do we approach feedback in the US or in a culture uh where feedback is more negative feedback is more indirect, right? So I call it the sandwich method, right? Where you start with positive feedback first, right? Specific and sincere positive feedback first, then the constructive criticism, clear but diplomatic, right? Tactful, diplomatic. And they tend to use what I call downgraders, right? Or words that kind of reduce the severity of what's being described. For example, you did a great job leading the meeting today. Your points were clear and well structured. However, one thing to consider that's very, very light is keeping your responses a bit shorter, right? A bit shorter, not that's the use of a downgrader to maintain engagement. But overall, your presentation was really effective, right? So you're kind of sandwiching the feedback, right, by stating what the person did well, what they can improve, and sort of making them feel good with overall you're doing a good job, right? Um, what about disagreement, right? So Julia has a good question before I move on. Is it true that the sandwich method doesn't work with other countries and cultures such as Latin America or Europe? Well, I mean, it's true to a certain extent, right? And I think if I scroll up in the chat here, there were a couple of individuals. I think let me just scroll up in the chat. Anna wrote, "Not comfortable, but also I don't like sugarcoating." Right? So um, there are cultures that don't really like when feedback is sugar-coated, don't really like the sandwich method of giving feedback. For example, the Dutch, right? If you've ever been to the Netherlands, if you've ever worked in a Dutch company, feedback is a lot more direct, right? And it's seen as more efficient, right? It's just getting it all out there and people receiving that feedback, making the changes and moving on, right? And personally, I see the appeal of that, right? You're able to just have a much clearer idea of what you need to change in order to improve. And personally, I kind of like when feedback is more direct and less sugar coated because that way it's more actionable for me, right? I can just make the changes that I need to make, and everything's a-okay, right? But again, it depends on the culture of the place that you're working in and also the culture of the company, right? And the best way to understand what sort of feedback works is to just observe, right? Observe how feedback is delivered around you before adapting to that, right? And it can also work on an individual basis. You could have people on your team who um, who actually want more direct feedback, right? And you can accommodate that. Another example of a cultural sort of flashpoint, let's call it, is when it comes to disagreement, right? Again, we've got the spectrum of countries. Again, this is more of a generalization than a hard and fast rule. But there are countries and cultures where confrontation can be seen as healthy, and I'm not talking about like actual physical confrontation. I'm talking about how we work through our differences, how we work through disagreements, and there are countries where confrontation is really avoided. Again, I'm using Malaysia as an example because I grew up there. Malaysia would be very far to the right. We are very non-confrontational, especially in public, right? In public, you don't confront people. Someone could be running naked down your train, right? Like if you're on public transport, somebody could be running naked up and down. You wouldn't confront them. You just like sort of just look the other way and ignore them, right? Very unconfrontational. And again, this is generalization, depends on different cultures and different individuals within that culture, but this is a general sort of idea of how people view confrontation. And here's a bit of a case study for you guys, right? We have Mr. Diaz and Mr. Chen. Mr. Diaz says, "Can you join us in the office on Sunday?" Mr. Chen says, "Yes, I think so. Um, that would be a great help. Yes, Sunday is an important day. In what way? Oh, it's my daughter's birthday. Oh, how nice. I hope you all enjoy it. Thank you for your understanding." Right? And this seems like a misunderstanding about to happen, right? Because Mr. Diaz is expecting Mr. Chen to come to the office, and I don't think Mr. Chen is coming to the office. I don't know. What do you guys think? Do you think Mr. Chen is going to come to the office? And so Silvina says, "I'm from Argentina, and when using the sandwich technique, you can often anticipate what's coming next, and that may be a reason why we tend to avoid it." Yeah, that's a very good point. A lot of people understand that the sandwich method is almost a form of manipulation in a way, like, oh, they're just warming me up before delivering, a bit of negative feedback, and some people don't like that. All right. So you guys in the chat are saying, no, he's not going to come, or he was close to going to the office. Well, I would say he's not going to come, but he expressed it in a very indirect way, right? Um, yes, I think so, right? I think I'm going to come to the office. That's a very diplomatic way of saying no in a lot of cultures. Yes, Sunday is an important day, right? He's saying, well, Sunday is an important day. It's my daughter's birthday. And Mr. Diaz uh, gave him permission to not come on Sunday without realizing he gave him permission. How nice. I hope you all enjoy it, right? That's kind of permission without, like, a very indirect form of giving permission. So Mr. Chen's not coming to the office, and maybe that was a, a mix up of expectations from this conversation, right? Saying no without saying no. Thank you, Paula. Okay. In cultures where confrontation is seen as healthy, the title says confrontational cultures. I think that might be a little bit harsh. Let's just call it in cultures where confrontation is seen as healthy. It's okay to push back on an idea, but not to make personal attacks, right? So it's okay to say, well, I disagree with this because of X, Y, and Z reason, but you don't want to resort or to devolve into using personal attacks, right? That's never a good idea. Um, you you should be ready to receive direct feedback, right? People are more likely to interrupt, to question, or to give constructive and even sometimes not so constructive criticism on your ideas openly. Confidence and clarity are respected, but emotional arguments weaken your position, right? You don't want to like attach a lot of emotion to it. And if you avoid engaging, it seems like you're unprepared. Like if you just avoid debating this idea, not debating in an aggressive sense, but debating in an intellectual sense, well, you may seem unprepared, right? Um, I see we've got a couple of comments here or questions. Helena says, "What about Germany? Feedback or disagreement? Thank you." Well, I would say Germany is a country that uh, is low context and is more open to direct feedback. I've worked with a couple of Germans in my time, and they were all very to the point, right? Very more direct than not, right? And I would say if you're working in a very German company, then probably your feedback is going to be a little bit more on the direct side, and being more open about solving issues is probably going to work to your advantage. But again, this also depends on the culture of the company. So my best advice would be to observe how things sort of are, and just mirror what sort of level of feedback uh, generally happens in the company or with the clients that you work with. But as a whole, I would say that German culture is a lot more direct than Asian culture, than a lot of Asian cultures, for example. Dimitri says, if Mr. Diaz didn't clarify what Chen meant, Mr. Chen would regret saying yes to it. True, very true. So going back to non-confrontational cultures, um, non-confrontational cultures or cultures that avoid confrontation, they really avoid saying no directly, right? And again, going back to my time in Malaysia, growing up, you never really said no to the boss. You would say all sorts of things like, maybe this isn't the best way forward, or this might take more time than we anticipate. You like saying no just feels very, it feels rude almost, right? So a lot of these cultures saying a direct no is almost considered unacceptable, right? Public disagreements as well, right? You don't really make a scene in the office. You don't really have serious arguments or disagreements in public. You take that one on one, right? Um, Silence or indirect responses may be a sign of disagreement. Not always, but maybe, especially silence, right? Um, Taking silence as a yes can be very dangerous in cultures that are more non-confrontational, right? Because you may assume that everyone agrees with you just from the room being silent, but that might not be necessarily the case. Same with getting feedback in group meetings, right? I'm sure you've all had this experience, given that you've worked with a bunch of different cultures. I'm sure you've all had this experience where in a group meeting you say, all right, does anyone have any feedback on this great business idea we're launching? And everyone sits there twiddling their thumbs, right? They're like, silence. You can hear a penny drop. But as soon as you get an anonymous survey out, I don't know if you guys ever had like an anonymous survey at work where you ask questions. That's when all the tea gets spilled, as it were, right? So feedback in group meetings may not be the most effective way of getting feedback in cultures that are more non-confrontational, right? So um, and even feedback one-on-one, if you're in a position of authority, right? If you're higher up in the hierarchy, it may still be difficult to get feedback um, one-on-one. I recall there was this very interesting book by an author called Malcolm Gladwell. It's called Outliers. I'm gonna put it in the chat. and I'm hoping I'm spelling his name correctly, but there's this book, Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell, and in this book he discusses many different things, but one of the things that he examines is in the, I think, late 70s, early 80s. There were a series of plane crashes involving Asian airlines. I think it was either Japanese airlines or airlines from Taiwan. I can't remember the specifics, but airlines from Asia. And one of the things he points out in this book is in many of these incidents, the co-pilots knew what was going on. Right, the co-pilots knew that there was some problem with the aircraft or a problem with the procedure that they were undertaking, but they didn't really raise their concerns. So they didn't, take the controls. They didn't do something that could have prevented disaster because of the hierarchical nature of the cockpit, right, where the captain is in charge of the aircraft and the co-pilot is, slightly lower on the hierarchy, right? And when these airlines discovered this, they started improving what they called CRM, crew resource management, in the aviation industry, and really worked to reduce the power distance in the cockpit. A lot of extra training when it came to ensuring that communication flowed well within the cockpit, and it worked, right? Like in the book, Malcolm Gladwell shows how uh, incidents involving pilot error where there was a communication breakdown dramatically reduced, right? And um, that really emphasizes how important communication can be, especially in environments where communication involves safety, right? And being open um, in your communication really matters, right? So Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell, really good book. All right, and Sin Poet, the interesting name, says great book. So it's not just me saying it. You got to listen to Sin Poet. Another comment there. Here we use the SCI method for feedback. You need to explain the situation, context, and impact. That way you can avoid emotional and personal feedback in a non-confrontational culture. It's good. Well, that's a good point. Explaining the situation, the context, and the impact. Um, that's a very good method, right? Because you're really making it factual and removing any sort of like it, any emotionality in it, right? You're very focused on what the situation is, the context of the situation, and any impact it may have. So thank you for that comment. That was a very good one. Okay, now we're on to how explaining some strategies that you can use to improve your cross-cultural communication. And throughout the previous part of the webinar, we've been covering some of this as we went along, but here are a couple more clear-cut ways that you can improve. And they're fairly straightforward and they seem fairly simple, but you'd be surprised at how many people don't really implement these, right? And the first strategy is really just observe, right? Study how each cultural framework is different from your own. And I don't mean study in the sense of like, get a book and start reading and making notes, although that might help you, but um, think of different situations that you've been in, right, with people from different cultures and how they acted in certain scenarios. And very quickly, you will start to see patterns, right? And these patterns, they say that stereotypes are bad, right? And I agree to a certain extent, right? You shouldn't stereotype people, but you should be aware that patterns exist and they exist for a reason. And if you're able to observe these patterns and recognize them, then you can adapt to those patterns and adapt your communication to things that you've seen, right? Notice how people give feedback, handle disagreements, and make decisions. And I've been saying this throughout the webinar, right? if you're new to a company, if you're new to a country, right, if you've emigrated, um, you can keep all this theory in mind, right, all the theory that I've discussed in this webinar in mind, but you really want to bring your own powers of observation to the fray, right? You want to notice how people give feedback, notice how disagreements are handled, and notice how people make decisions, and then adapt to that, right? Because it while there are generalities, things can differ based on the company that you work in, right? Again, I love using Malaysia as an example, but back when I worked in Malaysia, I worked for a very international company. It was located in Malaysia, but it was very international, and so the way we communicated was a lot more open, was a lot more, interactive versus if I worked for a very, very, local company which had very strict hierarchies, right? We've got a question. Some people are living together but are different cultures. So when a misunderstanding happens between those cultures, what shall we do? Well, it's the same concept, right? You may be in the same country, but from a different culture within that country, right? A lot of countries have many different races, many different cultures living in it, and you would just apply the same framework, but on a more micro level, right? So observe um, how someone from a different culture acts, how their cultural framework is different, and then based off of that, try and match the patterns, right? So essentially, use the same tips that I'm about to give you, but on a more micro level, right? On a country level uh, versus more globally. The second point, clarify, right? Um, I had a physics teacher, right? And this was when I was in high school, and I really enjoyed her lessons. She was great, really explained things very well. And one of the things she said, and I hope this doesn't get us kicked off the air. I don't know. I might get a message from HR after this, but one of the things she said, and it really stuck out for me, is in physics you cannot assume. When you assume, you make an ass out of you and me, right? Assume, right? And I remembered that phrase of hers. I graduated high school, I don't know, like more than 16 years ago, right? I still have it in my head. When you assume, you make an ass out of you and me, right? So don't assume. Ask open-ended questions to confirm understanding. And this is very important. And it's very important in my role today, right? I run a group of DevOps engineers, right, from different countries. And I never ask people if they understand, right? I never say, "Do you understand?" and frame it in a yes/no way, right? Because people have the tendency to say yes, even when they might not necessarily understand, right? And so usually, what I'll say is, "Okay, can you tell me in your own words what we're going to do here?" Right? Or can you explain the steps that we're going to take, right? So I know that you've understood the problem statement, right? And when I do that, the answer that they give me clarifies whether or not they've understood, right? Instead of me just asking, "Oh, do you understand?" I find the question, "Do you understand?" to honestly be, in most cases, a very useless question, rather, because people are going to want to say yes, right? Especially if you're the boss, right? If you're the manager, right? So try to ask open-ended questions, right? To confirm their understanding, or to confirm your understanding, right? And when you have any doubts, paraphrase and summarize, right? I think there was someone else wrote in the chat here. Artyom said, "I think there should be a clear recap at the end of the conversation." Well, yeah, I mean that's generally a good practice, right? Summarize, paraphrase, and check your assumptions with your audience to see if it makes sense, right? Um, be adaptive, right? Adjust your communication style based on who you're speaking to. And I think we're all good at this to a certain extent, right? I think we've all had the experience of being forced to adapt our communication style based on who we're speaking to, right? The way you talk to your manager is probably different from the way you talk to your friend, I would assume. Maybe not. I don't know. Maybe you've got a very good relationship with your boss and you treat him as a friend, but most of us have a different way of speaking um, to management versus our friends, right? And it's the same when it comes to cross-cultural communication. Just sort of adapt for your audience, right? And modify your approach to feedback and conflict resolution as needed. And it's very tempting to think that, oh, like, why do I have to adapt to this? It's the other person's problem, right? Like, oh, they're the ones who are communicating in such a vague way, or in such a like I feel so frustrated with this person because they're not very direct. It's very easy to feel that, right? And in a lot of cases, those feelings are valid, right? It can be a frustrating experience if you're communicating um, in a way that you're not familiar with, but think of it as being the path of least resistance, right? At the end of the day, what you want to do is get the job done well, right? And if you have to change your approach and change the way you communicate, the way you deliver feedback, that's generally easier than being frustrated and expecting the other person to change, generally, right? And I find that a much easier approach than just feeling frustrated, because you can't really do much with feelings of frustration. What you can do is just short circuit them completely and adjust your approach, right? Because what you have yourself under your control. You don't control other people, you control yourself, right? You're responsible for your own actions, and you're responsible for uh, making changes in order to take the path of least resistance when it comes to communication, right? And I don't know about you guys, but frustration is not a nice feeling for me to have. I tend to avoid it at all costs. Um, so those were the three sort of major tips that I had. I'd also like to recommend the book, The Culture Map by Erin Meyer. And Erin has coined some of the terms that I've used in this webinar: high context, low context cultures, cultures that are more confrontational versus less. Highly, highly, highly recommend picking up this book, The Culture Map. It really does formulate or formalize a lot of the thoughts you may have had around cross-cultural communication. Also, Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell. In fact, anything by Malcolm Gladwell is usually a good read. I put that in the chat. So, very good books to check out. There is a country mapping tool that's also based on the book, The Culture Map. And this tool allows you to click on whatever countries that you're working with. So I think someone asked about how to communicate with Germans, or how communication works in Germany. Well, this is a really cool tool that you scan the QR code, select the country, and it will tell you what sort of communication style they tend to use. Again, keep in mind these are generalizations, right? But generalizations based in reality to a certain extent, right? So feel free to use that tool. Very useful one. I'm going to leave it up a couple of seconds here so that you guys get a chance to scan the QR code. And in the meantime, if you guys have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. We've got a couple of minutes here. And I'm more than happy to answer any questions you may have. Also, just to reiterate, we do have a promo for the Power Skills at Work course, a very good comprehensive program that will really help you up-level your communication skills. There's a link in the chat that we've provided. You can use the word, or the code rather, POWER, DOWER, to receive 35% off any package. That's a pretty good deal. 35% off, not just 30, 35. So feel free to check that out. It's a very good course. You may hear my voice in some of it if you kind of like the juicelet tones that I've had on this webinar. The training programs are custom tailored. There's 3 different packages you can pick from, and you get a blockchain verified cert, which is pretty cool, right? You can put that on your LinkedIn profile. Blockchain verified, English for IT, power skills for tech certificate. And yeah, that is, we've come up to the end of the webinar. I hope it was useful for you. I hope you gained some insights into what it's like to work with different cultures. I'm here for the next, let's say, 5 to 10 minutes to answer any questions you may have. If you don't have any, well, it's been a pleasure seeing you all here today. And yeah, hope it was useful. And I think if you're watching this on YouTube, in the description below, you can claim your certificate of attendance. And there's the Power Skills for Work course with the 35% off code. And if you are looking for corporate training, right, there's a link that you can click on and you can book a consultation call. And we can come up with a corporate training plan for you and your employees or your staff. I see we've got a question from Anna. Are there any stereotyped written patterns that we should follow in written communication? Again, this written communication is a little bit different because levels of formality differ based on industry as well as culture, right? So, for example, I work in the tech industry, and the tech industry generally is a lot more laid back than if you were a lawyer, for example, right? If you're working in the legal industry, then your written communication is a lot more formal, right? I mean, have you ever written a lawyer's letter, right? It's really, it's almost another language, right? The level of formality that they use. And so when it comes to written communication, I would say it's a combination of culture as well as industry, right? Veronica says being diplomatic all the time is key. To a certain extent, yeah, being diplomatic allows you to be safe, but there are situations where you can't be diplomatic and you need to say, like, hey, this is a problem, we need to solve it, right? For example, with Malcolm Gladwell's book, right? If you're a co-pilot and your plane is, headed towards the ground at 200 miles an hour, then you can't be diplomatic. You got to be like, hey, I gotta I gotta grab the yoke here, no time for diplomacy. You got to just solve the problem. Artyom says, Karuna, from your experience, are high context cultures less productive or effective in business related communication? I would say they can be. If you're not familiar with high context cultures and high context communication, then yeah, it definitely can be uh, uh, very frustrating, right? Because one of the things that we covered with high context cultures is the fact that saying no is difficult for them, right? Being negative, like bringing negative news is not seen as a good thing, right? Even if it's a fact, right? You can't really argue with facts, but even bringing negative facts can be seen as in their heads as being bad at their jobs. And so if you're not used to that and you expect to be told when things aren't progressing well, that can be incredibly frustrating, right? Because you'll find out like 3 weeks down the line when it comes time to launch, they're like, oh, by the way, nothing works, right? Even though the last 3 weeks they were saying, yeah, things are good, yeah, progress is fine. So it can be. extremely frustrating, which is why it's good to understand and to use some of the tips that I mentioned about, you know, asking more open-ended questions, not saying things like, "Oh, is it going to be ready by this date?" Right? Yes or no. But asking, "Oh, where, like, what stage of development are we at? Have we done this testing? What were the results of these tests? You know, what latent, if it's like a technical product, right? Has the load test gone well, right? Really asking a lot of follow-up questions, open-ended follow-up questions can help you sort of get around this issue. I hope that answers your question, Artyom. All right, I'm gonna hang out for. Is it a paid tool? Simply speaking, is it a paid tool? Are you referring to the country mapping tool? I believe it's free. Um, I believe it's free. Like, I'm pretty sure in about 10 seconds, someone from my team is going to post in the chat whether or not it's free. So just hang on for that. Artyom says, by the way, all my Ukrainian colleagues are very good in low context approaches. My experience is mostly with technical people, though. Um, yeah, so that's one thing that I've noticed. Engineers, like software developers, uh, tend to be better when it comes to low context communication because it's very hard to argue with technical facts, right? Especially if you're a good software engineer, right? A mark of a good software engineer is understanding whether or not something is technically feasible and being able to express that, right? And you know, it's hard to argue with something that is very concrete, like the computer. The tech industry is one where there's a lot of sort of something either broken or it isn't, right? Something either works or it doesn't. There's a very black and white sort of uh, aspect to the tech industry. You can't really argue with code being broken. Okay, so simply speaking, access to the country mapping tool is $4 for 24 hours. So pay $4 and you furiously put in all the countries that you ever think you're going to work with, and you know, you'll be sorted. All right. Uh, any other questions before I jump off in about 60 seconds, let's say? Oh, thank you, Anna. You're very welcome. All right, cool. I'm going to head off now, but again, it's been a pleasure being with you all here this morning. If you do have any other questions, you know, you can reach out to me at karuna@englishforit.online. That's my personal English for IT email address. If you'd like um, to talk to English for IT when it comes to courses or any other questions you may have, I believe it's info@englishforit.online. But someone from my team is going to uh, put that in the chat, I'm sure. So thank you. Hope you had a great time. Have a good rest of your week, and I'll see you when I see you. Ciao.